The morning of December 16, 1598, dawned cold and silent over the churning waters of the Myeongnyang Strait, where Admiral Yi Sun-sin stood alone on the deck of his flagship, watching the horizon darken not with storm clouds but with sails. Before him lay the impossible: 12 Korean warships against a Japanese armada, over 300 strong, the final gambit in a desperate 7-year war that had left Korea a smoldering ruin. What unfolded in those narrow waters that day would become perhaps the most lopsided naval victory in human history, a tactical masterpiece so complete that it would later be studied alongside Thermopylae and Agincourt. Yet unlike those legendary last stands, Yi would win with almost no losses, a mathematical impossibility executed by a commander who knew he would not live to see the peace he was about to secure. Yi Sun-sin's path to that fateful December morning began not on the sea, but in the shadow of mountains, far from the waves he would one day master. Born in 1545 to a modest Yangban family, Korea's scholar official class, young Yi grew up in a household where military service was a hereditary duty but hardly a path to glory. The Joseon dynasty valued its civil servants far above its warriors, and ambitious parents dreamed of sons who would wield brushes, not swords. Yet even as a boy, Yi displayed an uncanny fascination with strategy, often reconstructing historical battles with stones and sticks while his peers recited Confucian classics. Military examinations came late for Yi, age 32, when most officers had already secured their first commands. The delay spoke not of reluctance, but necessity. Family hardships had forced him to prioritize survival over ambition. When he finally stood before the examiners, Yi's horseback archery drew startled murmurs. Here was a man who could hit targets while riding at full gallop, who understood instinctively that warfare was mathematics in motion. His first posting as a border garrison commander sent him not to sea but to Korea's northern frontier, where Yurkin raiders tested the kingdom's defenses. Yi transformed his undermanned outpost into an impregnable fortress through sheer ingenuity, designing new arrow-firing mechanisms that multiplied his soldiers' firepower tenfold. When a surprise night attack came, Yi didn't merely repel it, he lured the raiders into a devastating counter-ambush that left them decimated. The military establishment took notice, but not always favorably. "He thinks too much," one senior commander complained. "Soldiers need only obey, not innovate." Innovation, however, was precisely what the Korean Navy lacked. When Yi received his first naval command in 1591, a modest fleet protecting Korea's southwest coast, he found ships rotting at anchor and sailors who barely knew seamanship. Many naval posts were sinecures for aristocrats who rarely visited their ships. Yi upended this complacency with the ruthlessness of a man who sensed approaching catastrophe. He drilled his crews mercilessly, studied tidal patterns obsessively, and, most crucially, began sketching designs for a revolutionary warship that would become his signature weapon, the Joseon, or turtle ship. Covered with a spiked iron roof to prevent boarding and armed with multiple cannon ports, this vessel was purpose-built for the coming nightmare that only Yi seemed to foresee. That nightmare arrived in May 1592, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan's newly ascendant warlord who had unified his war-torn country through brilliant strategy and ruthless ambition, launched the largest overseas invasion Asia had seen in centuries. His target, Korea, which he viewed as merely the first stepping stone toward conquering Ming China. The Korean court, despite years of warnings from border officials noting Japanese preparations, reacted with near paralytic shock. As Japanese armies stormed northward, capturing the capital Seoul within weeks, only one segment of Korea's defenses held firm: the southwestern fleets commanded by a then obscure Admiral Yi. While Korea's army disintegrated in a series of catastrophic defeats, Yi's sailors were silently preparing for what would become the most remarkable naval campaign in East Asian history. A campaign that would begin with the advantage of surprise, but would ultimately rest on the strategic mind of a commander who had never set foot on a warship until his late 40s. The East Sea, known to Westerners as the Sea of Japan, was no placid highway in the 16th century, but a cauldron of competing ambitions and ancient grudges. For centuries, these waters had witnessed the ebb and flow of power between three civilizations: Korea's Joseon Dynasty, an orderly Confucian kingdom proud of its cultural refinement; Ming China, the colossus that considered itself the center of the civilized world; and Japan, an island nation emerging from a century of internal bloodletting, with newfound unity and dangerous hunger. The sea connected these powers but also served as their battlefield, where pirates, merchants, and navies played a deadly game of cat and mouse. For Korea, positioned as a peninsula jutting precariously between giants, naval strength wasn't merely a military consideration. It was existential. Toyotomi Hideyoshi understood this maritime chessboard better than anyone. Rising from peasant origins to become Japan's supreme warlord, Hideyoshi possessed ambition that matched his meteoric ascent. By 1590, having unified Japan through a combination of battlefield brilliance and political cunning, he found himself ruling a nation of battle-hardened samurai with no internal enemies left to fight. These warriors, masters of arquebus firearms acquired from Portuguese traders and tempered by decades of civil war, represented the most formidable fighting force in Asia. Like Alexander before him, Hideyoshi needed new worlds to conquer, and his gaze turned westward across the narrow sea. His demand that Korea serve as a vassal state and provide passage for his armies to invade China was destined for rejection, exactly the pretext he sought. The Korean court's response to this looming threat showcased the tragic disconnect that often precedes catastrophe. King Seonjo's advisors split into bitterly opposed factions, some dismissing Japanese capabilities while others urged desperate appeasement. Intelligence reports detailing Japanese preparations were buried under bureaucratic squabbles. When a Korean diplomat returned from Japan with alarming news of massive shipbuilding and troop concentrations, high officials accused him of exaggeration. "The Japanese are island barbarians," scoffed one minister. "They know nothing of proper warfare." This fatal arrogance extended to military readiness. Korea's army existed largely on paper, its soldiers untrained farmers who hadn't faced serious combat in generations. Hideyoshi struck with the precision timing of a lifelong gambler. His invasion force, over 158,000 men in the first wave alone, crossed the Korea Strait in an armada of hundreds of ships on May 23, 1592. The Japanese landing at Busan resembled less an invasion than a violent eruption, overwhelming the port's defenses within hours. What followed was a campaign of such speed that it seemed supernatural to contemporary observers. Japanese divisions raced northward in multiple columns, their arquebus-wielding infantry shattering Korean formations before they could organize. The capital, Seoul, fell on June 12th, just 3 weeks after the initial landings. By July, Japanese forces had reached the northern city of Pyongyang, and by August, they stood at the Yalu River, Korea's border with China. The speed of conquest had no parallel in Asian military history. The only glitch in Hideyoshi's master plan emerged in an unexpected quarter, the southwestern coastline, where Admiral Yi Sun-sin commanded the Jeolla Province fleet. While Korea's armies disintegrated and its king fled northward, abandoning his people, Yi launched a series of naval operations so devastatingly effective they threatened the entire Japanese logistical system. In his first major engagement at Okpo, Yi destroyed 26 Japanese ships without losing a single vessel of his own, a pattern of lopsided victory that would become his signature. The turtle ships, making their combat debut, proved impervious to Japanese boarding tactics and devastating in their firepower. What made Yi's success all the more remarkable was that he achieved it while receiving virtually no support from the central government, requisitioning supplies locally and building his own intelligence network through coastal villagers and fishermen. As reports of Yi's victories reached Hideyoshi, the warlord's response revealed both rage and recognition of a genuine threat. "Find me this Yi," he reportedly told his commanders. "Bring me his head, and I will give you a province to rule." The price on Yi's head grew with each Japanese ship sent to the bottom of the unforgiving sea. A sea that, under one admiral's command, had transformed from Japan's highway of conquest into a watery grave for their ambitions. Yet even as Yi's reputation soared among the Korean people, who began calling him the God of War, dangerous forces were aligning against him in the very court he was fighting to defend. Forces that would eventually succeed where Japanese cannons had failed, removing Korea's greatest admiral from command at the moment he was needed most. The true genius of Yi Sun-sin lay not in his courage, though he had that in abundance, but in his profound understanding that naval warfare required its own distinct approach. While other Korean commanders tried to replicate land battles at sea, Yi reimagined maritime combat entirely. His command headquarters at Yeosu hummed with constant innovation. There, in the winter of 1591-92, months before Hideyoshi's invasion, Yi had supervised the construction of his revolutionary Gyeobukseun, the turtle ships that would soon become legendary. Standing on the docks, watching shipwrights hammer the distinctive iron plates onto the vessel's rounded top, Yi was creating not just a warship, but a psychological weapon. The turtle ship's specifications revealed Yi's methodical mind. Approximately 100 feet long and 25 feet wide, the vessel's most distinctive feature was its covered deck, overlaid with hexagonal iron plates and protruding steel spikes that rendered enemy boarding attempts suicidal. This armored roof protected Korean sailors from Japanese arquebus fire and arrows while allowing Yi's crews to maneuver with impunity. Dragonhead prows concealed devastating forward cannons, which belched fire and smoke like the mythical beasts they resembled. Most ingeniously, Yi arranged for hidden sulfur smoke chambers that could be activated during battle, creating choking clouds that disoriented enemies while Korean gunners, familiar with their own ship's layout, fired through the haze with deadly accuracy. Even the oar configuration received Yi's careful attention, positioned beneath the waterline to prevent enemies from targeting his rowers. "The turtle ship is not a vessel but a promise," Yi wrote in his war diary. "A promise that Korean ingenuity will overcome Japanese numbers." This diary, meticulously maintained throughout the war, offers rare glimpses into the admiral's thinking, revealing a commander who left nothing to chance. Each night, regardless of his exhaustion, Yi recorded the day's events, analyzed enemy tactics, and planned future operations with a clarity that remains striking centuries later. Yi's tactical innovations extended far beyond ship design. Unlike Japanese naval commanders who treated the sea as merely a path to land battles, Yi understood maritime combat as a complex ecosystem influenced by winds, tides, and geography. He instituted Korea's first systematic naval intelligence service, recruiting fishermen and coastal villagers to report Japanese ship movements. This network gave him a constant picture of enemy activities, allowing him to strike at times and places of his choosing. When Japanese Admiral Kuroshima Michifusa attempted to lure Yi's fleet into open water near Joseon in June 1592, he sailed directly into a Korean ambush in narrow channels where his numerical advantage became meaningless. Kuroshima died on his flagship's deck, his head taken as a trophy, a shocking reversal for a samurai commander accustomed to Korean retreat. Perhaps Yi's most consequential innovation was his crane wing formation, a V-shaped arrangement of ships that could flex and contract like a living organism. Japanese naval tactics relied heavily on straight-line approaches, followed by grappling and boarding, where samurai excelled in close combat. Yi's crane wing negated this advantage completely. As Japanese vessels charged toward what appeared to be vulnerable Korean ships, the wings of the formation would swing inward, surrounding the attackers in a deadly crossfire from multiple directions. When the enemy believes he is the hunter, make him the hunted, Yi instructed his captains. Let them rush forward into our embrace, and then close the wings. The formation debuted at the Battle of Hanzando on August 14, 1592, resulting in the destruction of 59 Japanese ships and forcing Hideyoshi to reconsider his entire Korean invasion strategy. Yi's early victories came at a critical juncture when Korean resistance elsewhere had collapsed. The psychological impact on both sides proved incalculable. For battered Korean civilians, news that someone, anyone, was successfully fighting back against the seemingly unstoppable Japanese juggernaut provided desperately needed hope. For Japanese commanders, the sudden appearance of an unconquerable Korean admiral disrupted their timetable and security. Supply convoys from Japan now required massive naval escorts, diverting ships from other operations. Admiral Todo Takatora, one of Japan's most experienced naval commanders, admitted in a message to Hideyoshi, "We control the land, but this Yi controls the sea. Without the sea, we cannot hold the land." By April 1593, after 9 months of continuous operations, Yi's ledger was scarcely believable. 16 battles fought, over 300 Japanese ships destroyed, and not a single Korean warship lost under his direct command. Japanese sailors grew so terrified of encountering his fleet that some crews mutinied rather than sail into waters where Yi was reported. The invasion's supply lines grew increasingly precarious, forcing Japanese armies to forage more aggressively on land, which in turn intensified Korean guerrilla resistance. Yi had created a textbook example of how naval power could strangle a land invasion, a lesson that military academies around the world still study today. Yet Yi's methodical success bred powerful enemies, not in Japan, but in the Korean court itself. His independent operations and growing popularity among common Koreans threatened the entrenched aristocratic order. Court factions began whispering that his victories were exaggerated, his methods unorthodox, his loyalty questionable. The stage was being set for one of history's most tragic examples of political interference in military affairs. A betrayal that would temporarily remove Korea's greatest commander from the conflict and open the door to disaster. For all his tactical brilliance, Yi had yet to face his most dangerous opponent, the poison of court politics, against which neither turtle ships nor tiger tactics offered any protection. The messengers arrived at Yi's headquarters in Yeosu on a spring morning in 1597, bearing not congratulations for his unbroken string of victories, but an arrest warrant. The admiral read the royal command with a face that betrayed nothing to his stunned officers. After 5 years of holding back the Japanese tide almost single-handedly, Yi stood accused of treason, a charge that typically ended at the executioner's block. The path that led to this moment revealed the deadly intersection of international deception, court jealousies, and one admiral's unflinching integrity. The seeds of Yi's downfall had been planted by none other than Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself. The Japanese warlord, frustrated by Yi's stranglehold on maritime supply routes, had authorized a cunning stratagem. Japanese agents spread false intelligence that a small Japanese fleet would appear near Chilcheoliang, a location where the sea routes were dangerous and naval operations risky. This information was deliberately leaked to Korean spies, with the expectation it would reach Yi's headquarters. The trap was not aimed at defeating Yi in battle, a prospect that had proven impossible, but at manipulating Korean politics to remove him without firing a shot. The bait was taken not by Yi, but by his rivals at court. Prime Minister Yoo Seong-ryong had been Yi's staunchest defender, but he had lost influence to the ascendant Jung Cheol faction, aristocrats who resented Yi's independence and popularity. When the false intelligence reached the capital, Won Gyun, a jealous naval commander who had long coveted Yi's position, seized the opportunity. "Admiral Yi is growing too cautious," he told King Seonjo. "He invents excuses to avoid battle while exaggerating his achievements." The king, already suspicious of Yi's growing legend among common people, ordered the admiral to attack the supposed Japanese fleet immediately. Yi's response to this command would define his character more clearly than any battle victory. After investigating the waters near Chilcholyang, he confirmed what his experience had already suggested. The area's treacherous currents and hidden rocks made naval operations there extremely hazardous, especially given the absence of any actual Japanese ships. "I cannot obey," he wrote to the king. "There are no enemy vessels where reported, and to sail our fleet into such waters would risk destruction for no purpose." In a culture where royal commands carried divine weight, this response was tantamount to sacrilege. The speed of Yi's fall matched that of his rise. Royal interrogators arrived in Yosu and subjected Yi to judicial torture, beating his legs with a brutal device called the leg screw until the bones shattered. Even under this agony, Yi maintained his position. There had been no enemy ships where reported. When breaking his body failed to break his story, the court settled for breaking his career. Yi was stripped of rank, flogged in public, and sentenced to serve as a common soldier in the army. Won Gyun, his chief accuser, received his coveted prize, command of the Korean Navy that Yi had built. Yi's final message to his captains became famous throughout Korea. "I would rather die 100 times and have my corpse scattered to the dogs than endure this humiliation. Yet since I have not yet fully discharged my duty to the country, I will endure." As he was led away in chains, many of his loyal officers wept openly. One reportedly whispered, "The turtle has lost its head, but Japan has gained its greatest victory without a single arrow fired." The consequences of Yi's removal unfolded with the grim inevitability of tragedy. Won Gyun, eager to prove his superiority to his disgraced predecessor, led the Korean fleet into precisely the waters Yi had warned against. At the Battle of Chilcholyang in August 1597, one encountered not the small Japanese force of the false intelligence, but the entire Japanese navy. Over 500 ships, led by Admirals Todo Takatora and Kato Yoshiaki, who had been waiting in nearby concealed bays. What followed wasn't a battle, but an annihilation. Of the 169 Korean ships that entered the strait, only 13 escaped destruction. Won Gyun died attempting to reach shore, cut down by Japanese soldiers as he waded through the shallows. The scale of the catastrophe could hardly be exaggerated. In a single day, the naval advantage Yi had built through years of brilliant campaigning vanished. Japanese ships now controlled all Korean waters, reopening supply lines and allowing Hideyoshi to launch a second invasion. Korean coastal towns, previously protected by Yi's patrols, suffered devastating raids. King Seonjo, belatedly recognizing the magnitude of his error, issued a royal decree summoning Yi back to service. The messenger found the former admiral serving as a common soldier in the Northern Army, still walking with a pronounced limp from his torture. "The king orders you to resume command of the navy," the royal emissary stated. Yu looked up from cleaning his weapon. "What navy?" he asked quietly. "I am told there is no navy left to command." The king's message was blunt: rebuild the fleet and resume operations immediately. Yi's reply would enter Korean folklore: "As long as I live, there is still a Korean navy." Within days, he was journeying south again, back to the coastline he had defended for years, back to face an enemy now grown bold in his absence, and back to command a fleet that consisted of just 13 battered ships, the sole survivors of Myeongnyang's disaster. The stage was now set for one of history's most remarkable comebacks. Yi faced impossible odds: a shattered fleet, demoralized sailors, and over 300 Japanese warships controlling Korean waters. Conventional military wisdom dictated a defensive posture, perhaps hiding the remaining ships in protected inlets while slowly rebuilding strength. But Yi had never been conventional. As he limped aboard his new flagship at Yosu Harbor, the admiral was already formulating a plan so audacious that even his loyal captains would question his sanity. The Japanese had destroyed Korea's navy, reopened their supply lines, and paved the way for a new invasion that threatened to complete the conquest Hideyoshi had begun. What they hadn't counted on was the return of the one man who understood that in naval warfare, ships and sailors mattered less than the mind that commanded them. Begin with what remains, not what is lost. Yi's first command, upon resuming his admiralty, set the tone for what would follow. Standing on the dock at Yosu Naval Base in August of 1597, he faced a scene of desolation. Where once hundreds of warships had crowded the harbor, now only 12 battered vessels, plus his hastily reassigned flagship, remained. The shipyards lay mostly abandoned, their skilled workers scattered during Myeongnyang's disastrous tenure. Most of the experienced sailors had perished at Chilcholyang, and the survivors carried the hollow-eyed look of men who had witnessed apocalypse. Any reasonable commander would have retreated inland to rebuild over months, perhaps years. Yi gave himself 12 days. His first act revealed his pragmatic genius. Rather than trying to construct new ships, impossible given time constraints, Yi dispatched riders to every fishing village along the coast. "Bring me your boats," the message read, "not as a tax or seizure, but as a loan to save our land. Each vessel will be registered, each owner compensated." Within 3 days, dozens of fishing boats began arriving, small, ungainly craft never intended for war. Yi's shipwrights worked around the clock, reinforcing hulls, installing crude cannon mounts, and fitting basic armor plating, salvaged from sunken warships. "They are ugly, but will float and fight," Yi noted in his diary. "Beauty is a luxury we cannot afford." The manpower problem proved more challenging. Most experienced sailors lay dead or captured, and conventional recruitment would take months. Again, Yi improvised. He appealed directly to the families of fallen mariners, calling on sons to take their fathers' places, brothers to replace brothers. "Your family has already paid in blood," his message stated. "Now we ask you to honor that sacrifice by continuing their fight." The response overwhelmed even Yi's expectations. Young men arrived by the hundreds, some barely teenagers, others gray-bearded fishermen, all carrying whatever weapons they could find and offering themselves for service. Training this impromptu navy required Yi to reinvent naval education. With no time for traditional methods, he instituted what he called shadow learning, pairing each inexperienced recruit with one of his few veteran sailors. "Watch, imitate, then act," became the mantra, with crews practicing basic maneuvers from dawn until dusk. Yi personally supervised cannon drills, teaching gunners to compensate for their lesser weapons by concentrating fire. "We cannot match them ship for ship," he told his officers. "Therefore, we must make each shot count double." The most revealing aspect of this desperate preparation came in Yi's requisition orders. Rather than pleading for weapons, he demanded maps, detailed charts of every inlet, current and tidal pattern along Korea's southern coast. The sea itself must become our ally, he instructed his captains. We will fight only where water and wind favor us. Each night by lamplight, Yi studied these maps obsessively, committing to memory the complex hydrology of Korea's coastal waters, knowledge that would soon prove more valuable than 100 warships. Court officials, hearing of Yi's frenetic preparations, responded with predictable skepticism. One royal inspector arrived unannounced, expecting to file a report condemning the admiral's futile efforts. He found Yi aboard his flagship, drilling sailors past midnight despite a driving rainstorm. "You cannot possibly hope to defeat the Japanese with this collection," the inspector remarked, gesturing toward the motley fleet. Yi's response was calm but pointed. "I do not hope, sir. I intend." The human cost of this rebuilding effort became evident in Yi's private writings. The admiral drove himself hardest of all, sleeping barely 3 hours nightly. His injured legs, never properly healed from torture, caused him constant pain that he concealed from his men. "My body protests what my mind demands," he wrote in his journal, but there is no time for either complaint or rest. When his personal physician warned that his punishing schedule might kill him before he faced the enemy, Yi reportedly answered, "Then at least I will die trying to save my country rather than watching it fall." On the 11th day of preparation, a fishing boat slipped into Yosu harbor, carrying news that transformed Yi's desperate situation into a potential opportunity. The Japanese fleet, over 300 ships strong, and believing the Korean Navy effectively destroyed, had divided into several squadrons to support land operations. Admiral Todo Taketora, commanding their largest division of approximately 133 vessels, was preparing to sail through the Myeongnyang Strait, a narrow channel separating Jindo Island from the mainland. This channel, barely half a mile wide at its narrowest point, was notorious among local sailors for its treacherous whirlpools and unpredictable currents. As Yi absorbed this intelligence, the fisherman who delivered it added one crucial detail. "The tide changes at noon tomorrow, Admiral. When it turns, the currents reach speed no oar can fight against." That night, Yi summoned his captains to the flagship. The assembly no longer filled the deck as in former days, just 13 officers standing before a commander, many still considered the greatest admiral in Korean history. Yi unrolled a detailed chart of the Myeongnyang Strait and placed it before them. "Gentlemen," he said, tracing the narrow channel with his finger, "tomorrow we will fight and win here." The captains exchanged worried glances. Even the most optimistic among them could see the mathematics of doom: 13 ships against 133, odds of 10 to 1. "Admiral," one veteran officer finally spoke, "we cannot possibly—" Yi cut him off with unexpected sharpness. "Cannot. We have 13 ships. Had we but one, I would still fight." The statement, recorded by Yi's aide Min Deok-gi, who was present, silenced all objections. Yi continued, now pointing to specific features of the strait. "We will not fight the Japanese fleet. We will fight alongside the sea against ships that do not understand our moods." As the meeting dispersed, Yi made a final entry in his war diary, words that would later be inscribed on monuments throughout Korea. "I still have 12 ships under my command. As long as I live, the enemy shall never be safe upon our waters." With this declaration, Yi completed his preparations for what naval historians would later rank among the most lopsided battles in maritime history. His battered fleet, a collection of rescued warships, converted fishing boats, and hastily trained crews, prepared to sail against the mightiest naval force in East Asia. Facing odds that made Thermopylae seem favorable by comparison, Yi was betting everything on his intimate knowledge of one narrow strait and the arrogance of enemies who believed him defeated. As his small fleet slipped out of Yosu Harbor before dawn on September 16, 1597, Yi stood at the bow of his flagship, facing the direction of the coming battle. According to Min Deokgi's account, the admiral's expression showed neither doubt nor fear, only the calm certainty of a man who has found exactly the right place to die. The Myeongnyang Strait appears unremarkable on most maps, a narrow channel separating Jindo Island from the Korean mainland, barely half a mile wide at its narrowest point. What no map could adequately convey was the lethal complexity of its waters. Beneath the surface, an underwater topography of sudden ridges and deep troughs created one of the most turbulent tidal environments in East Asia. When tides changed, water funneled through this constriction at speeds approaching 10 knots, faster than any oar-powered vessel could navigate. Local fishermen treated these waters with superstitious dread, speaking of powerful spirits that dragged ships to their doom in swirling vortices that appeared without warning. Yi's selection of this battlefield represented tactical thinking at its most sophisticated. In normal naval combat, the Japanese fleet's 10-to-1 numerical advantage would have been insurmountable. But the Myeongnyang Strait's unique hydrodynamics created a natural bottleneck that neutralized this advantage entirely. The channel was too narrow for more than a few Japanese ships to enter abreast, preventing them from bringing their superior numbers to bear simultaneously. Moreover, the strait's powerful currents would force enemy vessels to commit to a single direction of travel. There would be no turning back once they entered the channel. Dawn on September 16, 1597, revealed perfect conditions for Yi's strategy. A light fog clung to the water's surface, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards, enough to navigate by for crews familiar with the strait, but disorienting for Japanese sailors entering these waters for the first time. Yi deployed his 13 vessels in a precise formation just north of the strait's narrowest point, using a small island named Usuyong as an anchor for his right flank. This positioning ensured that any Japanese ships passing through would be caught in a crossfire, while simultaneously fighting the strengthening current from behind. Remember, Yi instructed his captains before taking position, "We fight with the sea as our ally. When the tide turns at midday, not even the strongest Japanese oarsmen will be able to retreat. They must come forward to us or be swept onto the rocks." He ordered his crews to maintain absolute silence. No drums, no shouts. Let the enemy believe they sail into empty waters. Surprise will multiply our strength. Admiral Todo Takatora approached the strait with the supreme confidence of a commander who believed his opposition effectively destroyed. Having received reports that Yi had somehow reassembled a small force, Todo dismissed them as desperate propaganda. "Yi may have a dozen fishing boats playing at being warships," he reportedly told his captains before the battle. "We will swat them like flies." Todo's massive fleet stretched for miles behind him as he led the vanguard toward the strait in his ornate flagship, its sails emblazoned with the Takatora family crest. The first Japanese vessels entered the strait around mid-morning, proceeding cautiously through the fog. As they approached the narrowest section, Todo made a critical decision that played directly into Yi's hands. Rather than sending scouts ahead, he ordered his fleet to maintain tight formation, standard practice in open-water naval combat, but catastrophic in a confined channel. The result was a compressed column of ships, each following closely behind the one ahead, creating a tightly packed line stretching back beyond the strait's entrance. Yi, observing from his flagship positioned behind Usuyong Island, waited with preternatural patience. According to Lieutenant Min's account, the admiral stood motionless at the bow, watching as Japanese ships continued to flow into the strait like water into a trap. Only when approximately 60 enemy vessels had entered the channel did Yi give his first command: signal the attack. The Korean assault began not with a headlong charge, but with a single ship, Yi's flagship, emerging from behind Usuyeong Island, directly into the path of the Japanese vanguard. The sudden appearance of the Korean admiral's Blue Dragon standard in what had appeared to be empty water created momentary confusion in the Japanese line. Todo, recognizing the flagship, ordered an immediate attack, sending his lead vessels surging forward to overwhelm this apparently suicidal Korean warship. What followed demonstrated why Yi's tactical genius transcended his era. As Japanese ships accelerated toward his seemingly isolated flagship, Yi ordered a controlled withdrawal, pulling back just beyond effective archer range. The pursuing Japanese vessels, intent on their prey, failed to notice that they were being drawn precisely where Yi wanted them, into the strait's central channel where the current's power would soon reach its peak as the tide turned. Meanwhile, Yi's 12 remaining ships remained hidden, some behind Usuyeong, others tucked into small coves along the mainland shore. The turning point came shortly before noon, announced by subtle signs only an experienced mariner would recognize. A slight change in the water's surface texture, the gradual shifting of floating debris. Yi, watching these indicators, gave the command that initiated the true battle. Now. On this signal, Korean vessels emerged simultaneously from their hiding places, forming a crescent-shaped blockade across the northern exit of the strait. At the same moment, the tide began to turn, creating the channel's infamous countercurrent. Japanese ships suddenly found themselves caught between an emerging Korean fleet to their front and a strengthening current pushing from behind. Worse, the narrow channel prevented them from maneuvering into their preferred battle formations. Yi exploited this moment of Japanese disorientation with precision, ordering his ships to target enemy vessels at the narrowest point of the strait. Korean cannon, though fewer in number than their Japanese counterparts, delivered concentrated fire at point-blank range into ships now struggling against both current and confusion. The first Japanese vessel to sink created a cascade effect in the tightly packed formation. Ships behind collided with those ahead, creating a chaotic tangle of vessels, all increasingly at the mercy of strengthening currents. Korean sailors, intimately familiar with the strait's behavior, navigated its treacherous flows with practiced ease. Yi's flagship darted between enemy vessels like a predator among confused prey, delivering devastating broadsides before slipping away with the current. Japanese commanders, accustomed to straightforward boarding actions, found their tactical playbook rendered useless by both the environment and Yi's unconventional approach. The decisive moment came when Todo's flagship, attempting to rally the Japanese force, found itself caught in one of the strait's infamous whirlpools, a massive vortex created by conflicting currents colliding at the strait's narrowest point. The Japanese admiral's magnificent vessel, despite the frantic efforts of hundreds of oarsmen, began a slow, inexorable spin toward the center of the maelstrom. Yi, recognizing the opportunity, ordered all available ships to concentrate fire on the stricken flagship. Under this barrage, Todo's vessel began taking on water, listing heavily before capsizing completely. The sight of their admiral's flagship disappearing beneath the churning waters broke Japanese morale. What followed wasn't so much a battle as a rout. Ships at the rear of the Japanese formation attempted to retreat, only to find themselves fighting against currents now flowing at full strength. Vessels collided, oars shattered, and carefully maintained formations disintegrated into chaos. Those ships that managed to turn found themselves being swept sideways onto jagged rocks along the strait's edges. By mid-afternoon, the water was littered with floating debris, capsized ships, and struggling swimmers. Yi, rather than pursuing fleeing vessels, ordered his small fleet to hold position at the strait's northern exit, creating a gauntlet through which any surviving Japanese ships would need to pass. This disciplined restraint, focusing on controlling the battlefield rather than pursuing individual targets, ensured that the Korean force maintained its cohesion throughout the engagement. As sunset approached, the scale of Todo's disaster became apparent. Of the approximately 133 Japanese ships that had entered the strait, 31 had been sunk outright, with dozens more damaged beyond repair or run aground. Korean losses amounted to just 2 sailors killed and 3 wounded. No ships were lost. The lopsided outcome defied conventional military mathematics so completely that initial reports were dismissed as fantasy by both Korean and Japanese authorities. Todo Taketora himself escaped the battle aboard a small boat after his flagship sank, reaching the remaining portion of his fleet that had not entered the strait. That night, rather than attempting another passage, the Japanese admiral ordered a complete withdrawal from Korean waters, effectively ending Japanese naval operations in the region. It was the first major Japanese retreat since the invasion began. Yu's entry in his war diary that evening was characteristically understated. Today, using only 13 ships, heaven granted us victory over the enemy. I owe this to the swift currents of the strait and the courage of my men. What he did not write, but what would become clear in subsequent days, was that this improbable victory at Myeongnyang had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire war. The Japanese invasion, dependent on secure maritime supply lines, had just lost its naval dominance at the hands of 13 ships and one extraordinary commander who understood that terrain, timing, and knowledge could overcome even the most overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The year following Myeongnyang saw a profound transformation in the war's dynamics. Yi's miraculous victory had collapsed Japanese naval dominance overnight, severing critical supply lines and forcing their armies to subsist on dwindling resources. By late 1598, Hideyoshi's health was failing, and his once grand vision of continental conquest had devolved into a grinding stalemate. Korean and Chinese forces steadily reclaimed territory, pushing the invaders back toward their coastal footholds. In August came the news that would ultimately seal the conflict's fate. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the architect of Japan's ambitious invasion, had died in his Fushimi castle, leaving a succession crisis and increasingly dubious military adventure. Japanese commanders in Korea received secret orders, negotiate peace terms while preparing for a complete withdrawal. The invasion that had begun with dreams of an empire stretching to Beijing would end with a quiet evacuation, but only if they could secure safe passage home across waters now dominated by Admiral Yi Sun-sin's resurgent navy. Through his intelligence network of coastal villagers and fishermen, Yi learned of these developments by early December. "The enemy prepares to abandon our shores," he wrote to King Seonjo. "But we must not allow them to depart unpunished for the rivers of Korean blood they have spilled." The admiral's position was clear. The retreating Japanese army represented both an opportunity and a moral imperative. These were the forces that had burned Korean cities, massacred civilians, and taken thousands of artisans as captives to Japan. To permit their escape without consequence was unthinkable. King Seonjo's response revealed how dramatically court attitudes toward Yi had changed since his disgrace and rehabilitation. "We entrust this final battle to your judgment alone," the royal command stated. "End this war as you see fit." This extraordinary latitude, unprecedented in Korean military hierarchy, spoke volumes about the admiral's restored standing. After years of micromanagement and interference, the court had finally recognized that Yi's instincts had proven right at every turn. By December 15, 1598, Yi's intelligence confirmed that the Japanese evacuation fleet had assembled near the islands of Namhae and Noryang, Approximately 500 ships, carrying the remnants of their Korean occupation force, awaited favorable winds to begin their homeward journey. Among the commanders was a face familiar to Yi, Admiral Shimazu Yoshihiro, whose forces had clashed with Korean ships throughout the war. Intercepted communications revealed Shimazu's intention to depart under cover of darkness within the next 48 hours. Yi now commanded a very different fleet than the desperate collection of ships he had led at Myeongnyang. Following that victory, King Seonjo had finally provided the resources Yi had long requested. The Korean Navy had been rebuilt to approximately 150 warships, including several newly constructed turtle ships. Supplementing these were 200 vessels from Ming China's fleet under the command of Admiral Chen Lin, a respected commander who had developed a grudging admiration for his Korean counterpart. The combined force represented the largest Allied fleet assembled in East Asian waters in centuries. On the afternoon of December 15th, Yi summoned both Korean and Chinese captains to his flagship for a final council of war. The atmospheric details of this meeting, recorded by Yi's aide Min, paint a vivid picture of the stakes. Snow fell lightly on the assembled vessels, officers shivering beneath thick winter cloaks as they gathered in the flagship's stern cabin. Maps of the Noryang Strait, where intelligence suggested the Japanese would attempt passage, covered the central table. The Chinese admiral, Chen Lin, advocated for a cautious approach. "The enemy is cornered and desperate," he argued. "Let them leave. The war is won regardless." His concern was understandable. Peace negotiations were already underway between Ming China and Japan. An unnecessary final battle could complicate diplomatic efforts. Yi's response, according to multiple accounts, was unequivocal. "We have not fought for 7 years to allow them easy departure with Korean prisoners in their holds and Korean blood on their swords." He then outlined his plan for an attack at dawn, a frontal assault on the Japanese evacuation fleet as it passed through the relatively narrow strait between Namhai and the mainland. Unlike the complex hydrology of Myeongnyang, this would be a straightforward engagement, 2 large fleets meeting in open combat. As the council dispersed, Yi asked his most trusted senior captain, Kim Eok-chu, to remain behind. Once they were alone, Yi handed Kim a sealed packet of letters. "These are for my family," he said quietly. "Ensure they are delivered, regardless of tomorrow's outcome." This simple act, unusual for the normally reserved admiral, hinted at a premonition that even his closest officers didn't fully comprehend at the time. Later that evening, Yi retired to his private cabin and made what would be his final diary entry. "Tomorrow will bring either great victory or honorable death. I find myself strangely content with either outcome." Then, breaking with his usual practice of retiring early before battle, Yi remained on deck well past midnight, standing at the bow of his flagship, observing the stars and distant Japanese campfires. Lieutenant Min's account of these hours offers a rare glimpse into the admiral's private thoughts. "I approached with a message from the Chinese admiral," Min wrote. "The admiral acknowledged me but continued gazing toward the enemy position. After a long silence, he spoke not of tomorrow's battle, but of his home in Asan that he had not seen in years. He described the view from his garden in spring, when azaleas colored the hillsides. It was the only time I ever heard him speak of home with such longing." Around 3 a.m., Yi finally ordered preparations for battle. Ships' crews were roused, weapons distributed, and positions assigned. The admiral's final instructions to his captains were precise. Form a crescent formation, concentrate fire on Japanese troop transports rather than the warships, and maintain discipline regardless of how the battle unfolded. "Remember," he reportedly told them, "it is not our task to escape death, but to ensure our deaths, if they come, serve our nation's cause." Dawn. on December 16th arrived with a light fog shrouding the water, weather strikingly similar to the conditions at Myeongnyang. Yi, now dressed in his full ceremonial armor with the distinctive red commander's sash across his chest, took position on the flagship's elevated stern castle. According to sailors present, his final order before engagement was curiously personal rather than tactical. Let the musicians play the battle hymn of Hansan, the stirring melodies that had accompanied his greatest victory. Years earlier, echoed across the water as the Korean fleet moved into position. Across the strait, Japanese lookouts spotted the approaching Allied fleet and raised the alarm. Shimazu Yoshihiro, recognizing the dragon insignia on Yi's flagship, reportedly uttered a phrase that captured the sentiment of many Japanese commanders who had faced the admiral over 7 years of war. "It seems we must deal with the god of war one final time." As the morning sun began burning away the fog, revealing 2 massive fleets arrayed for battle, Yi raised his command sword, the signal to advance. The Korean vanguard surged forward, turtle ships leading the charge, their dragon-headed prows belching smoke and fire. Behind them stretched the might of the combined Korean-Chinese fleet, over 300 vessels strong, bearing down on the Japanese evacuation force in what would become the final major naval battle of a war that had devastated the Korean peninsula for 7 bloody years. Neither admiral could know that by day's end, one would lie dying and the other would face the difficult choice between honor and survival. As the distance between the fleets closed, a momentary lull fell. That strange, suspended instant before combat that every warrior recognizes. The last breath before chaos erupts. In that moment, according to Korean accounts, Yi Sun-sin stood tall on his flagship's deck, his commanding presence visible to friend and foe alike, embodying the indomitable spirit that had sustained Korea's resistance through its darkest hours. The final act of his extraordinary career was about to begin. The first cannon shot of the Battle of Myeongnyang echoed across the water at approximately 5:45 a.m., fired not from Yi's flagship, but from a Japanese vessel, an impulsive discharge that fell short, sending up a harmless splash several yards from the Korean line. Yi, observing this premature attack, made a swift tactical adjustment. Rather than continuing the planned measured advance, he gave the signal for full attack speed. "The enemy lacks discipline," he called to his officers. "Press them before they can organize." This decision, one of countless battlefield calculations Yi had made throughout the war, set the tone for what followed. The Korean vanguard, led by 3 turtle ships in flying wedge formation, accelerated toward the center of the Japanese evacuation fleet. Behind them, the main Korean line advanced in perfect crescent formation, while Chinese vessels under Admiral Chen-lin protected the flanks. The disciplined approach contrasted sharply with the increasingly chaotic Japanese response, as transport ships laden with soldiers and equipment attempted to maneuver into defensive positions. Shimazu Yoshihiro, commanding the Japanese forces, faced a commander's nightmare. His fleet consisted primarily of transport vessels carrying retreating troops, ships designed for capacity rather than combat. His dedicated warships, though formidable, were outnumbered by the combined Korean-Chinese fleet. Worse, the narrow confines of the strait limited his ability to maneuver. Recognizing the dire situation, Shimazu made a bold decision. He would sacrifice part of his fleet to secure the escape of the remainder, particularly the ships carrying high-ranking commanders and valuable Korean prisoners. The collision between the fleets occurred with shocking violence. Korean turtle ships, their iron-spiked roofs gleaming in the winter morning light, smashed directly into the Japanese center. Cannon fire at point-blank range shredded wooden hulls and sent deadly splinters scything through crowded decks. Korean naval infantry, now battle-hardened after 7 years of war, poured devastating arquebus fire into Japanese vessels from protected positions behind bulwarks specially designed by Yi for this purpose. Yi's flagship operated as both command center and primary assault vessel, consistently positioning itself at the most critical points of the battle. Lieutenant Min's account captures the admiral's commanding presence. The admiral stood exposed on the stern castle, directing movements with his command sword, seemingly oblivious to enemy arrows falling around him. When a Japanese ship approached on our starboard side, he personally directed our cannon fire, adjusting the elevation by hand to achieve greater accuracy. The battle's first turning point came approximately 1 hour after engagement. The Korean right wing, executing a flanking maneuver Yi had practiced extensively during training, succeeded in isolating several Japanese command ships from their escorts. Among these was the vessel carrying General Konishi Yukinaga, one of the original invasion's primary architects and a commander responsible for numerous atrocities against Korean civilians. Yi, recognizing the opportunity, redirected his flagship and 2 supporting vessels to target Konishi's ship specifically. The resulting encounter demonstrated the evolution of Yi's tactical thinking since the war's early days. Rather than attempting to sink Konishi's vessel, Korean ships executed what modern naval theorists would later call a mobility kill, systematically destroying its rudder and oars without compromising its flotation. The crippled ship, unable to maneuver but still afloat, became a stationary target for sustained Korean arquebus fire. This approach maximized enemy casualties while preventing the loss of potential intelligence and prisoners that would occur if the ship sank. Konishi himself, according to Japanese accounts later collected by Korean historians, attempted to maintain order aboard his stricken vessel, even as Korean marksmen systematically eliminated his officers. When Korean boarding parties finally stormed the ship approximately 30 minutes after it was immobilized, they found the general mortally wounded but still issuing commands from the blood-slicked deck. His capture represented a significant symbolic victory, one of the invasion's principal leaders taken by the Korean forces he had once expected to conquer easily. By mid-morning, the battle had spread across nearly 2 miles of water, fragmenting into dozens of individual ship-to-ship engagements. This development favored the Japanese, whose samurai excelled in boarding actions and close combat. Recognizing this danger, Yi issued a series of flag signals, ordering his captains to maintain distance where possible, relying on superior Korean artillery rather than risking boarding actions. This discipline proved critical as the battle progressed into its 3rd hour. Around 10 a.m., Shimazu Yoshihiro executed his contingency plan. Having recognized that complete escape was impossible, he ordered approximately 1/3 of his fleet, primarily consisting of slower transport vessels, to form a defensive perimeter, sacrificing themselves to delay the Allied pursuit, while the remainder of the Japanese fleet attempted to break through the strait's southern exit toward open water. This decision split the battle into 2 distinct engagements, the main fleet action continuing in the strait's center, and a new race to intercept the escaping Japanese vessels. Yi, observing this maneuver from his elevated position, made what several historians later identified as his final tactical masterpiece. Rather than dividing his forces proportionally, which would have reduced effectiveness in both engagements, he committed approximately 80% of his fleet to pursuing the escaping Japanese, while assigning just enough vessels to contain the sacrificial rear guard. The enemy sacrifices these ships precisely because they value those fleeing more, he reportedly told his officers. Therefore, we must concentrate on the prey they most wish to protect. This decision proved prescient. Among the escaping vessels were ships carrying thousands of Korean prisoners, artisans, scholars, and young women forcibly taken for transport to Japan. These captives represented both irreplaceable cultural knowledge and a humanitarian crisis Yi had personally vowed to address. His fleet's swift pivot to pursuit potentially saved thousands of these prisoners from a life of exile and enslavement. The pursuit phase of the battle showcased the superior speed and handling of Korean warships, designs Yi had personally refined through years of combat experience. Fast Korean patrol craft overtook slower Japanese transports, delivering devastating archer fire to their sterns where defensive capabilities were weakest. Yi's flagship led this pursuit, consistently positioning itself at the vanguard despite the increased risk this posed to the commander. By noon, the battle had evolved into a running engagement stretching nearly 5 miles from north to south. The Japanese sacrificial force in the strait's center had been largely neutralized, with surviving vessels beached or surrendered. The focus now centered entirely on preventing the escape of Shimazu's main force, which continued moving steadily southward toward open water, where their superior numbers might finally offer advantage. It was during this critical pursuit phase, at approximately 12:30 p.m., that the battle's defining moment occurred. Yi's flagship, having overtaken several Japanese vessels, found itself slightly isolated from supporting Korean ships. A group of Japanese warships, recognizing both the flagship's vulnerability and Yi's personal presence aboard, converged to attack. Lieutenant Min described what followed. Enemy ships approached from 3 directions, concentrating their archer fire on our command deck, where the Admiral directed operations. He remained standing despite officers' pleas to take cover, stating that his visibility to our fleet mattered more than personal safety. What happened next has been documented in multiple Korean and Japanese accounts, with remarkable consistency despite coming from opposing sides. A Japanese sniper aboard one of the converging ships, approximately 100 yards distant, fired a shot that struck Yi in the left armpit, penetrating beneath his armor into his chest. The Admiral immediately collapsed. His son, Yi Ho, and his nephew, Yi Wan, both serving as officers aboard the flagship, rushed to his side. According to Yi Wan's subsequent report, the Admiral's first words after being wounded were not about his condition, but about the battle. The enemy fleet must not escape. Keep beating the drums. Do not announce my death. This command, to conceal his fatal injury from both his own forces and the enemy, reflected Yi's understanding of morale's crucial role in warfare. The order was immediately implemented, with the Admiral's body shielded from view by screens, while drum signals continuing to issue from the flagship as though he remained in command. Yi's son later recorded his father's final instructions, delivered in failing voice as they carried him below decks. "Fight on until all enemy ships are destroyed. My death is nothing." Minutes later, at approximately 12:45 p.m., Admiral Yi Sun-sin died, his final breaths coinciding with what would prove to be his greatest victory. The flagship's officers, honoring their commander's last wishes, maintained the fiction of his continued leadership. Drum commands continued to flow, and the Admiral's personal standard remained flying. When necessary, orders were issued in Yi's name, through intermediaries. This deception proved crucial as the battle entered its final phase, a desperate chase to prevent the Japanese evacuation fleet from reaching open water beyond the strait. By mid-afternoon, what had begun as a coordinated naval battle had transformed into dozens of individual pursuit actions as Korean ships relentlessly hunted down escaping Japanese vessels. The final tally, compiled days later from reports across the combined fleet, painted a devastating picture of Japanese losses. 249 ships confirmed sunk or captured, with approximately 18,000 casualties among their forces. The Allied fleet, despite its overwhelming victory, had suffered too, nearly 250 Korean and Chinese sailors killed or severely wounded. As darkness fell on December 16, 1598, the surviving Japanese ships, less than half their original number, finally broke free into open water, carrying Shimazu Yoshihiro, and the remnants of Japan's Korean expedition toward home. Behind them lay not just a battlefield, but the closing chapter of a 7-year conflict that had nearly destroyed the Korean kingdom. And in the dimly lit cabin of a victorious flagship, wrapped in simple cloth rather than ceremonial regalia, lay the body of the commander who had performed the seemingly impossible, defeating two of history's greatest naval powers, Japan and his own court's political machinations, through sheer strategic brilliance. Yu's final command, to conceal his death until victory was complete, remained honored for 3 more days as his fleet continued pursuing Japanese stragglers. Only after the last enemy vessel had disappeared over the horizon did his son finally lower the admiral's standard and announce that Korea's greatest commander had fought his final battle. The nation that had once imprisoned and tortured him would soon venerate him as its greatest hero, a transformation as remarkable as any of the victories he had won against impossible odds. The Battle of Myeongnyang marked not only Yi's final stand, but the culmination of his lifelong study of maritime dynamics. Unlike most naval commanders of his era who treated the sea merely as a platform for combat, Yi understood water as an active participant in warfare, a force that could multiply strength or nullify advantage, depending on how one synchronized with its rhythms. This sophisticated understanding played a decisive role throughout the engagement, though its full extent remained unknown to his enemies. Prior to the battle, Yi had dispatched scouts to observe not just Japanese positions, but tidal conditions in the strait. Their reports confirmed what nautical tables already told him. December 16th would feature an unusually strong winter tide, with currents reaching maximum velocity around mid-morning, precisely when he planned to initiate the main attack phase. This wasn't coincidence, but careful engineering. Yi had deliberately scheduled his assault to align with these conditions, knowing that retreating Japanese vessels would face the dual challenge of combat and contrary currents simultaneously. The tide's effect became evident approximately 2 hours into the battle. Japanese ships attempting to maintain formation found themselves fighting against strengthening currents that pushed them northward, directly toward the advancing Korean fleet. Ships that lost propulsion, whether through damage or crew casualties, drifted helplessly into Korean firing positions. Yi had effectively weaponized hydrodynamics, creating an invisible current-based funnel that channeled enemy vessels into his most advantageous firing sectors. Korean vessels, conversely, operated with the current's assistance, achieving greater speeds and maneuverability while conserving crew energy. Yi's flagship demonstrated this advantage repeatedly, executing tight turning maneuvers that would have been impossible without the current's additional force. Lieutenant Min noted this phenomenon. The admiral's vessel moved as though possessed by water spirits, turning in half the space a Japanese ship required and accelerating with supernatural swiftness when the moment demanded. The technical details of turtle ship operations during Myeongnyang have been preserved through both Korean naval records and captured Japanese reports. Far from the simple ramming vessels depicted in popular accounts, Yi's turtle ships functioned as sophisticated weapons platforms optimized for the specific environmental conditions of Korean coastal waters. Their partially submerged hull design gained stability from the very currents that destabilized conventionally shaped Japanese vessels. The iron-spiked roof, often portrayed as merely anti-boarding protection, served a hydrodynamic purpose as well, creating a low-pressure zone that increased stability during sharp maneuvers. Most remarkably, Yi had instructed his turtle ship captains to exploit a phenomenon modern naval architects call wave piercing, positioning their vessels to cut through rather than ride over approaching wave patterns. This technique, documented in Yi's pre-battle orders, reduced visible profile during approach and maximized stability during cannon fire. Japanese commanders accustomed to ships that rode higher in the water consistently misjudged firing distances when targeting these vessels, resulting in numerous wasted volleys. By mid-battle, these hydrographic advantages had created a stark disparity in combat effectiveness. Korean vessels operated with increasing coordination as the engagement progressed, while Japanese ships grew increasingly disorganized. The difference wasn't merely tactical, but fundamental. Yu's fleet worked in harmony with water conditions his enemies barely comprehended. The human dimension of the battle revealed equally stark contrasts. Korean crews, many veterans of multiple engagements under Yi's command, operated with a discipline rarely seen in 16th century naval warfare. Cannon crews maintained consistent firing rates even as the battle intensified, following Yi's standing order. Better one accurate shot than 10 hasty ones. Each Korean vessel maintained dedicated damage control teams, an innovation Yi had introduced years earlier, allowing ships to sustain and repair combat damage without withdrawing from engagement. Japanese forces, despite their samurai tradition, displayed the limitations of an army-centric force pressed into naval service. Their ships carried substantial numbers of infantry, but lacked specialized sailors. When naval operations faltered, as when currents pushed vessels off course, there was insufficient maritime expertise to compensate. Korean accounts describe Japanese vessels colliding with one another as their formation compressed in the strait's narrowest section, creating chaos without Korean forces firing a single shot. The most vivid accounts of the battle's human toll come from Korean medical records compiled afterward. Yi had instituted the unprecedented practice of assigning physician-surgeons to major vessels, another innovation ahead of his time. Their clinical reports detail horrific injuries, limbs shattered by cannon fire, mass casualties from fire arrows igniting crowded Japanese transports, drowning victims pulled from water so cold that rescuers suffered frostbite. These documents reveal the grim reality beneath the battle's strategic brilliance. Hundreds of men dying in conditions of shocking violence. Equally revealing are accounts from Korean prisoners liberated during the battle. Transport ships carrying artisans, scholars, and women seized during the Japanese occupation found themselves under attack by their countrymen's vessels. Several narratives describe the terror of being below decks during naval artillery exchanges, followed by the bewildering moment of rescue. One scholar, Hwang Yeo-il, recorded his experience. The ship shuddered as though struck by lightning. Water poured through splintered planks. As we prepared to drown, Korean voices called from above. Hands reached down. The same navy we had believed destroyed years earlier had returned to save us. The battle's central tragedy occurred when Yi fell, but the operational consequences of his death were minimized through extraordinary discipline. His son and senior officers maintained the command deception flawlessly, relaying orders that aligned with Yi's established patterns so convincingly that neither Korean nor Japanese forces realized leadership had changed. This seamless continuation of command represented perhaps the Admiral's greatest legacy, a command structure so well trained it could function even without its architect. The afternoon phase of the battle transformed from formation combat to what Yi had termed wolfpack pursuit, groups of 3 to 5 Korean vessels coordinating to isolate and destroy individual Japanese ships. This approach, documented in Yi's tactical manuals, maximized the impact of Korea's smaller fleet. Rather than diluting firepower across the entire enemy formation, wolfpacks concentrated overwhelming force against selected targets, ensuring destruction rather than mere damage. The psychological impact proved as significant as physical losses. Japanese vessels witnessed their companions being systematically destroyed by these predatory groups, further degrading already faltering morale. Weather conditions, initially favorable with morning fog that concealed Korean approach formations, shifted significantly by afternoon. Historical weather records from the region indicate a strong, northerly wind developed around 2 p.m., a common winter pattern in the strait. This wind further hampered Japanese escape efforts while giving Korean pursuit vessels additional speed. Yi, who maintained detailed meteorological journals throughout his career, had anticipated this weather pattern. His pre-battle orders specified different sailing configurations for morning and afternoon operations, demonstrating an environmental awareness central to his command philosophy. As darkness approached, the battle's final phase revealed an unexpected dimension of Yi's comprehensive approach to warfare. Korean vessels, beginning pursuit operations before dawn, carried specialized night combat equipment, hooded lanterns that illuminated enemies while concealing their own position, reflective shields that amplified moonlight toward target vessels, and night-specific signaling systems using differently colored lights. Japanese forces, lacking these innovations, found themselves at severe disadvantage as daylight faded, unable to coordinate effectively while still visible to their pursuers. By battle's end, the water itself bore physical testimony to the engagement's intensity. Contemporary accounts describe the strait's surface littered with debris for miles, broken oars, personal belongings, rice bales from ruptured supply ships, and hundreds of bodies, creating a macabre obstacle course for ships still in pursuit. The environmental impact lingered for months, with local fishing communities reporting unusual concentrations of scavenging wildlife and flotsam washing ashore along the coast for weeks afterward. The tide that had aided Korean vessels in the morning had completed its cycle by evening, now flowing southward and accelerating the retreat of surviving Japanese ships. This final hydrographic shift, one Yi did not live to witness, provided escape for Shimazu's remaining vessels, preventing the total annihilation of Japanese forces that complete victory would have represented. Yet even in this incomplete triumph, the battle's outcome remained decisive. The Japanese withdrawal from Korea, already underway diplomatically, was now militarily irreversible. As night fell completely on December 16, 1598, Yi's flagship maintained its position at the vanguard of pursuing Korean vessels. The admiral's body lay in the ship's stern cabin, covered with his own battle standard, the blue dragon that had become synonymous with Korean resistance. Above, on the command deck, drumbeats continued to issue orders in his name, and sailors manned their positions with the discipline he had instilled through years of leadership. The deception he had ordered with his dying breath would continue until victory was complete, his final strategic insight ensuring that even in death, he remained an active force in the battle that would secure his nation's survival. The psychological collapse of Japanese naval forces following Yi's final victory unfolded with remarkable rapidity. By dawn on December 17th, the remnants of Shimazu's fleet had regrouped approximately 15 miles offshore, beyond immediate Korean pursuit range, but far from safety. Intercepted communications later captured by Korean intelligence revealed the depth of Japanese disarray. The sea belongs to their admiral, Shimazu reportedly told his subordinates during an emergency council. "We cannot contest these waters again." What Shimazu couldn't know was that the admiral he so feared already lay dead, his body now preserved in salt and snow within his flagship's hold. The Korean command maintained their extraordinary deception through the critical post-battle period, issuing orders in Yi's name through his son and senior officers. Ship's captains arrived for council meetings and departed with instructions, never realizing they had not actually seen their commander. This charade, maintained for tactical rather than political reasons, prevented the Japanese from recognizing the opportunity that Yi's death might have presented for a final counteroffensive. The demoralization among Japanese forces manifested in increasingly desperate decisions, Rather than maintaining a cohesive retreat formation, individual commanders began breaking away, each seeking the fastest route back to Japan, regardless of overall strategy. This fragmentation created precisely the vulnerability Yi had sought to exploit throughout his career. Isolated vessels that could be engaged individually, rather than as a coordinated fleet. Though Yi was no longer present to direct operations, the Wolfpack pursuit tactics he had developed continued to pick off these strays one by one. Korean naval records document 43 additional Japanese vessels destroyed during these pursuit operations between December 17th and 19th, each a testament to the systematic hunting methodology Yi had perfected. Korean ships operated in coordinated groups of 3 to 5 vessels, using a relay approach where fresh pursuit craft would replace those requiring rest or resupply. This created the impression of an inexhaustible Korean naval presence, an illusion that further degraded Japanese morale. The human cost of this final phase was considerably lighter than the main battle, but no less poignant. Korean medical reports describe treatment provided to Japanese survivors pulled from frigid waters, enemy sailors who often expressed shock at receiving care rather than execution. One Japanese officer, upon learning he was being treated aboard the flagship of the fleet that had just destroyed his own vessel, reportedly asked, "Why does your great admiral spare his enemies?" The Korean physician, unaware that Yi was already dead, answered simply, "Because he measures victory in ships, not corpses." Back in Hanseong, modern Seoul, news of the Noryang victory arrived on December 20th. Transmitted via the fire beacon system Yi had helped renovate earlier in the war. King Seonjo, who had so recently rehabilitated the admiral after his disgrace, ordered immediate preparations for a hero's welcome. Royal couriers departed the capital, carrying ceremonial robes and insignia for Yi's formal elevation to the highest rank. Chungmugong, Loyal Warrior, a title never before bestowed during a recipient's lifetime. These messengers would arrive to discover they carried honors for a commander already dead. The decision to finally reveal Yi's death came on December 19th, after the last pursuing Korean vessels had returned to the main fleet. His son Yi Ho, himself wounded during the battle, formally lowered his father's command flag and announced to the assembled fleet that their admiral had died, ensuring their victory. The reaction among Korean sailors remains one of the most moving episodes in the nation's military history. Hardened veterans who had followed Yi through impossible odds for 7 years openly wept on their decks. Several captains reportedly had to be physically restrained from pursuing the remaining Japanese ships in suicidal vengeance attacks. Ming Admiral Chen Lin, upon learning of Yi's death, performed an unprecedented act of cross-cultural respect. He ordered his entire Chinese fleet to lower their flags to half-mast, the first recorded instance of this mourning practice being extended from one navy to honor another nation's commander. Chen's official report to the Ming Emperor contained a tribute remarkable for its forthright assessment. Had Admiral Yi been born in China, he would have been equal to our greatest historical commanders. That he arose in a small tributary state makes his achievements all the more extraordinary. The voyage returning Yi's body to the capital revealed the depth of his connection with the Korean people. As the funeral barge progressed along the coast, villagers lined shores to pay respects, many the same coastal communities that had served as Yi's intelligence network throughout the war. Fishermen who had risked their lives carrying messages past Japanese patrols now cast flower petals on the water before the procession. In several harbors, the ceremonies lasted through entire nights, with lanterns illuminating waters where Yi's victories had kept Korean sovereignty alive. In the Japanese imperial court, news of Noryang and Yi's death arrived simultaneously, creating a complex dual reaction. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would soon establish the shogunate that would rule Japan for over 2 centuries, reportedly responded to the news with profound ambivalence. "Korea has lost a great admiral," he stated, "but perhaps now Japan may know peace with our neighbor." This pragmatic response reflected recognition that Yi's existence had rendered any future invasion attempts futile, his death potentially opening diplomatic paths previously blocked by his uncompromising stance toward Japanese aggression. Yi's final victory reshaped East Asian politics far beyond the immediate military outcome. The decisive defeat at Myeongnyang accelerated the complete withdrawal of Japanese forces from the Korean peninsula, with the last troops departing in December 1598. But the battle's longer-term consequences proved even more significant. Japan's failed Korean venture had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and depleted resources that might have sustained further continental ambitions. The trauma of defeat, particularly at sea where Japanese forces had expected easy superiority, would redirect Japanese expansionism away from Korea for nearly 3 centuries. For Korea itself, the Imjin War's conclusion came at staggering cost. Nearly 1/3 of cultivated farmland lay destroyed. Entire villages had been depopulated through massacre, starvation, or displacement. The captives taken to Japan, particularly skilled artisans and scholars, represented an irreplaceable cultural loss. Yet amid this devastation, Yi's victories provided a crucial foundation for national recovery, proof that Korea could defend itself even against the era's most formidable military power. The Korean royal court's relationship with Yi's legacy revealed the complex political dynamics that had both hindered and ultimately recognized his genius. King Seonjo, who had both disgraced and rehabilitated Yi during the admiral's lifetime, became the chief promoter of his veneration after death. Whether motivated by genuine admiration or political calculation, the king ordered the construction of shrines to Yi throughout the country and commissioned the first formal biography of the admiral's life and campaigns. The subtext was clear. The monarchy sought to associate itself with Yi's unquestioned heroism, perhaps hoping his popularity might transfer to a royal institution whose prestige had been severely damaged by its early failures during the invasion. Yi's strategic innovations continued influencing naval warfare long after his death. The battle formations he developed, particularly the crane wing and envelopment tactics, appeared in Korean naval manuals for centuries. His turtle ships represented such advanced thinking that fully armored warships wouldn't appear elsewhere until the ironclad vessels of the 19th century. Most significantly, his comprehensive approach to naval warfare, integrating environmental factors, technological innovation, and psychological operations, established principles that remain relevant in modern maritime strategy. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Yi's final victory was how it transformed defeat into salvation. When he had resumed command after Wongyun's disaster, Korea's navy consisted of 13 ships against hundreds. Conventional military wisdom would have dictated defensive operations, perhaps guerrilla tactics, certainly not direct engagement with superior forces. Yi's willingness to attack against overwhelming odds, and his ability to convert those attacks into victories, reversed the entire strategic trajectory of the war. From the seemingly hopeless moment of his return to command, each Korean victory built momentum that culminated in the decisive triumph at Myeongnyang. As Yi's funeral barge approached Hansung in early January 1599, the capital city that had once dismissed his warnings about Japanese invasion now stood in mourning for the commander who had proven prophetic. Thousands lined the Han River banks in silence as the vessel passed, a stark contrast to the political squabbling that had characterized the court's treatment of Yi during much of his service. In death, the admiral received the unanimous recognition that politics had denied him in life. The man who had saved Korea would now become the symbol of its endurance, a transformation already beginning as his body completed its final voyage to the nation he had preserved. Through tactical genius, iron discipline, and the rarest form of courage, the willingness to be right when every authority insisted he was wrong. The full accounting of Myeongnang's aftermath emerged only gradually as reports filtered in from scattered engagement zones across miles of churning water. Yi's meticulous system of battle documentation, with each ship captain required to submit detailed action reports, continued functioning even after his death, generating the comprehensive records that would later allow historians to reconstruct the engagement in remarkable detail. The final tallies proved staggering. 249 Japanese vessels confirmed destroyed or captured, approximately 18,000 enemy casualties, and hundreds of Korean prisoners liberated from transport ships bound for Japan. More significant than these numbers was the strategic outcome. Japan's last organized naval force in Korean waters had been shattered beyond recovery. Korean losses told a different story, one that validated Yi's tactical approach even in his absence. Just 10 Korean ships had been sunk, with 139 sailors killed and 331 wounded. The Chinese fleet under Admiral Chen Lin had suffered slightly higher casualties, having engaged in the close-quarters combat Yi typically avoided. These figures represented the lowest loss ratio of any major engagement in the 7-year conflict, a testament to Yi's doctrine of maximizing enemy casualties while preserving his own force. Even in death, his methods had proven devastatingly effective. Among the documented Japanese casualties was Admiral Konishi Yukinaga, whose capture during the battle represented a symbolic victory of particular significance. As one of the invasion's primary architects and the commander responsible for the initial landing at Busan in 1592, Konishi had become a hated figure in Korea, his name synonymous with the occupation's brutality. His capture aboard a disabled vessel during Myeongnang's early phase provided a moment of poetic justice that resonated deeply with Korean forces. According to Lieutenant Min's account, Konishi maintained samurai dignity even in defeat, requesting permission to commit ritual suicide rather than face captivity. This request was denied. Korean command, still operating under Yi's standing orders regarding high-value prisoners, insisted he be returned to Hanseong for formal justice before the king. The human dimension of victory extended beyond military outcomes. Aboard captured Japanese transports, Korean soldiers discovered approximately 500 countrymen, scholars, artisans, and young women seized for transport to Japan as part of the systematic cultural looting that had characterized the occupation. These liberated captives provided first-hand accounts of conditions within the Japanese evacuation fleet, describing overcrowded holds, minimal provisions, and the growing desperation among retreating forces. One scholar, Yi Gyung-seok, recorded the moment Korean troops breached the hold where he had been confined. Light poured down from above, followed by faces I had not expected to see again in this life. They called to us in our own tongue, saying we were saved, words I had ceased believing possible. For the Korean sailors, who had followed Yi through impossible odds, victory came with the bitter knowledge that their commander had not lived to witness it. Personal accounts from ship captains reveal the emotional devastation that spread through the fleet once Yi's death was finally announced on December 19th. Captain Bae Seol, commanding one of the turtle ships that had led the initial assault, wrote, "I have not wept since childhood, yet found myself unable to speak through tears. We have won everything and lost everything in the same moment." This sentiment echoed throughout the fleet. The culmination of 7 years' struggle had coincided with the loss of the leader who had made that struggle possible. The notification of Yi's family fell to Lieutenant Min, who departed the fleet on December 20th to deliver the news to Yi's wife and remaining children at their home in Asan. His account of this journey provides a glimpse into the personal cost behind Yi's public service. The admiral had seen his family only 5 times during the 7-Year War, maintaining his coastal commands with monastic dedication, while governance of his household fell to his wife. Min described his arrival at the family compound. "Before I could speak, the admiral's wife knew. 'He has fulfilled his duty to the end,' she said. Not a question, but a statement. I could only bow in confirmation." Korean military protocol dictated that Yi's body be preserved for formal state funeral, a process that began immediately after his death aboard the flagship. Ship's carpenters constructed a specially sealed casket packed with snow and salt to prevent decomposition during the journey to the capital. The flagship itself was converted to a funeral barge, with Yi's command quarters transformed into a temporary shrine where officers could pay respects. The barge departed the fleet's assembly point near Namhai Island on December 22nd, beginning the solemn coastal voyage toward Hanseong. The funeral procession's route followed the same coastline Yi had defended throughout the war, passing sites of his greatest victories, Okpo, Sacheon, Hanzando, and Myeongnyang. At each location, local officials organized ceremonial observances that blended Confucian ritual with spontaneous public mourning. The most poignant of these occurred at Myeongnyang Strait, where Yi had achieved his miracle victory with just 13 ships a year earlier. Local fishermen formed a flotilla of hundreds of small boats, creating a ceremonial corridor through which the funeral barge passed. As darkness fell, each boat lit lanterns, transforming the strait into a river of light, honoring the commander who had transformed it into a symbol of Korean resistance. King Seonjo received news of Yi's death while preparing to bestow the admiral's promotion to Chungmugong rank. The monarch's reaction, recorded by court chroniclers, revealed genuine shock despite the political complications of his relationship with Yi. "Heaven has taken from us the shield of our nation," he reportedly stated, before ordering the most elaborate funeral ceremonies permissible under court protocol. The posthumous title would still be granted, making Yi the first Korean commander to receive this highest military honor without aristocratic birth or political connections. More significantly, the king ordered the establishment of state-sponsored shrines to Yi throughout the country, institutionalizing the admiral's veneration in Korea's ancestral worship tradition. As the funeral barge approached Hanseong in early January 1599, it encountered an unexpected diplomatic delegation, representatives from the Ming Chinese court who had traveled specifically to pay respects to the Korean admiral. This extraordinary gesture, unprecedented in the hierarchical relationship between Ming China and its Korean tributary state, reflected the reputation Yi had established even beyond Korea's borders. The senior Ming diplomat, Liu Ting, performed formal prostration before Yi's casket, an act typically reserved for honoring Chinese imperial officials, and presented the admiral's family with ceremonial gifts from the Ming emperor himself. The diplomatic message was clear. Yi's achievements had transcended national boundaries, earning recognition from the era's dominant East Asian power. The formal funeral ceremonies in Hanseong spanned 9 days, the maximum period allowable for non-royal burials, extended by special decree for Yi's unique status. Court records document extraordinary public participation, with thousands of citizens joining the official procession despite bitter January cold. The posthumous elevation to Chungmugong rank was officially conferred during these ceremonies, with the king personally overseeing the ritual bestowal. More significantly for Yi's legacy, Seonjo ordered the formal publication and preservation of the admiral's complete war diaries and tactical writings, ensuring his methods would be studied by future generations of Korean military leaders. Yi's final resting place reflected both his accomplishments and the complex relationship between his achievements and established authority. Rather than the remote family gravesite typical for military commanders, Yi was entombed near a san, with monument inscriptions composed by the kingdom's most prestigious scholars. The site would evolve into something approaching a national shrine over subsequent centuries, a physical manifestation of Yi's transformation from controversial commander to national symbol. The location, visible from the coastline Yi had defended, seemed particularly fitting for a man whose greatest victories had occurred within sight of Korea's shores. The strategic consequences of Yi's final victory extended far beyond military outcomes, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of East Asia for centuries to follow. Japan's withdrawal from Korea marked not just the end of a single conflict, but the abandonment of continental ambitions that had driven Hideyoshi's invasion. The traumatic defeat, particularly the naval disasters inflicted by Yi, redirected Japanese expansion towards Southeast Asia and eventually the Pacific, regions where they wouldn't face the Korean Navy that had proven so devastatingly effective. This reorientation of Japanese strategic focus would endure until the late 19th century, providing Korea 3 centuries of security from its island neighbor. For Korea itself, the war's end brought both profound relief and daunting challenges. The Japanese occupation had devastated the peninsula's agricultural infrastructure, destroying irrigation systems and reducing cultivated land by nearly a third. The population had decreased by an estimated 1 million through combat casualties, famine, disease, and forced deportation to Japan. Rebuilding would require decades, with some regions never fully recovering their pre-war prosperity. Yet amid this devastation, Yi's victories provided a crucial foundation for national identity, proof that Korea could defend itself against the era's most formidable military power. Perhaps the most revealing assessment of Yi's impact came not from Korean sources, but from his enemies. Japanese naval archives from the early Tokugawa period contain surprisingly candid evaluations of the Korean admiral who had inflicted their greatest defeats. Admiral Dodo Takehisa, who had faced Yi in several engagements, left a tactical analysis that acknowledged the Korean admiral understood aspects of maritime warfare that our commanders had never considered. His vessels moved in patterns that seemed without logic until the moment we realized we had been enveloped. By then, escape was impossible. This professional respect from those he had defeated perhaps constitutes Yi's most meaningful military epitaph. The price of victory extended beyond the human toll to encompass profound cultural transformation. The Imjin War marked the end of Korea's traditional confidence in Chinese protection and military guidance, a dependency shattered by Ming forces' initial failures to halt the Japanese advance. Yi's victories had demonstrated that Korean defensive capabilities, properly led and organized, could succeed where even the mighty Ming military had struggled. This newfound self-reliance would influence Korean military development for generations, with Yi's tactical writings becoming required study for naval officers well into the 19th century. For the sailors who had served under Yi, the men who had followed him through impossible odds, defeats, disgrace, and ultimate triumph, victory brought complicated emotions. Many had lost family members to Japanese occupation forces. Returning to devastated hometowns after 7 years at sea, they discovered homes destroyed and fields untended. Yet alongside this personal devastation, they carried the knowledge of having participated in Korea's most improbable resurrection. From a nation nearly conquered to one that had driven out invaders against overwhelming odds. Captain Bae Seol, one of Yi's most trusted officers, perhaps best captured this duality in a poem written after returning to his village near Yosu. Our houses lie in ashes, our fields in weeds, yet we return undefeated. This victory belongs not to those who ordered war from palace halls, but to those who fought it from blood-soaked decks. As winter deepened across the Korean peninsula in early 1599, the last Japanese stragglers withdrew from coastal footholds they had occupied for 7 years. Reconnaissance vessels under Yi's former captains patrolled empty waters where enemy fleets had once sailed with impunity. On shore, communities began the slow process of rebuilding, repairing fishing boats, restoring fields, reconstructing homes. The monumental task of national recovery was just beginning, but it proceeded with one certainty that would have been unimaginable in the invasion's darkest days. Koreans were rebuilding on soil that remained Korean, beneath a sky still dominated by their own banners rather than the rising sun of Japan. This fundamental freedom, the continuation of Korean sovereignty, represented Yi Sun-sin's ultimate legacy. The admiral had departed, but the nation he had saved endured. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 18, 1598, nearly a month before Yi's final battle, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had died in his Fushimi castle, his grand ambitions of continental conquest unfulfilled. This crucial information, traveling slowly across winter seas, reached Korean shores only after Myeongnyang had been fought and Yi himself had fallen. The war's two towering figures, the Japanese warlord who had launched history's largest overseas invasion, and the Korean admiral who had thwarted it, had departed within weeks of each other, their 7-year struggle concluding with neither witnessing its final resolution. The political vacuum created by Hideyoshi's death triggered immediate power realignments within Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the calculating daimyo who would soon establish the shogunate that would rule Japan for over 2 centuries, seized the opportunity to consolidate control. Among his first strategic decisions was the complete abandonment of Korean territorial ambitions. "The peninsula has cost us enough blood," he reportedly told his council. "Let us look elsewhere for Japan's destiny." This pragmatic reorientation reflected not merely political calculation, but recognition of the hard lessons taught by Yi's naval victories. That Korea, properly defended, represented an unacceptable quagmire for Japanese ambitions. The final Japanese evacuation unfolded throughout early 1599, with remaining garrisons abandoning coastal strongholds they had occupied since 1592. Korean army units advancing into these vacated positions discovered scenes of deliberate destruction: wells poisoned, fortifications sabotaged, and available food supplies contaminated. This scorched earth withdrawal reflected the bitterness of Japanese commanders who had entered Korea expecting swift conquest only to depart 7 years later in defeat. General Konishi Yukinaga, captured at Myeongnyang and now imprisoned in Hanseong, reportedly told his Korean interrogators, "We came believing your country would fall in 20 days. How could we know you had a dragon guarding your waters?" For Korea, the war's conclusion brought recognition that victory had been purchased at nearly unbearable cost. Contemporary census records document population losses approaching 1 million, nearly 20% of the pre-war population, through combat, disease, famine, and forced deportation to Japan. Agricultural production had collapsed to less than half its 1591 levels. Entire regions, particularly in the southern provinces that had borne the invasion's initial fury, lay depopulated. The cultural losses proved equally devastating. Thousands of scholars killed, libraries burned, and cultural treasures looted for transport to Japan. The Korean court established a special ministry tasked with cataloging these losses, an accounting that would later serve as the foundation for repatriation demands that continue into the modern era. Yi's former naval commanders played unexpected roles in the post-war reconstruction. Rather than returning to obscurity, these officers, men like Kim Eok-chu and Bae Seol, were appointed as regional governors in coastal provinces, where they applied organizational skills developed under Yi's command to civilian recovery efforts. Their ships, converted from war footing to transport duties, became crucial conduits for moving reconstruction supplies to devastated regions. This naval-to-civilian administrative transition represented an innovation in Korean governance. Recognition that the discipline and logistics expertise developed during the conflict could serve peaceful rebuilding equally well. The most poignant post-war voyages involved not warships, but small, nondescript vessels carrying Korean prisoners liberated from Japan through diplomatic channels. The Tokugawa government, seeking to establish more productive relations with Korea, agreed to repatriate civilians captured during the occupation. Between 1600–1603, approximately 7,500 Koreans were returned through these arrangements, a fraction of those taken but a significant diplomatic gesture nonetheless. Many returnees had spent years in captivity, becoming cultural intermediaries who brought Japanese technical knowledge back to Korea. Ironically, some of the ceramic production techniques that would define later Korean artistry entered through these returned prisoners, who had been forced to work in Japanese pottery workshops during their captivity. Yi's final legacy unfolded through his voluminous writings, particularly his comprehensive war diary, the Nanjung-ilgi, that provided daily accounts of his activities throughout the conflict. Unlike standard military reports focused solely on operations, Yi's journal captured his inner thoughts, ethical struggles, and strategic reasoning alongside battle details. In 1604, King Seonjo ordered these writings compiled, published, and distributed to provincial military academies as instructional texts. This preservation effort ensured that Yi's tactical innovations and leadership philosophy would influence Korean military development for centuries, while simultaneously establishing the documentary foundation for his historical assessment. The most revealing aspects of these writings emerge not from Yi's victories, but from his periods of adversity, particularly the entries following his disgrace and imprisonment in 1597. Rather than bitterness or self-justification, these passages reflect stoic acceptance coupled with unyielding commitment to national defense. "Though I am reduced to the lowest rank," he wrote while serving as a common soldier, "my duty to protect our shores remains unchanged." This philosophical resilience, maintaining purpose through humiliation, would later become central to Yi's veneration as a moral exemplars transcending mere military genius. Yi's family experienced the complex aftermath of heroism in ways both privileged and painful. His posthumous elevation to Chungmugong rank brought material benefits, tax exemptions, educational opportunities, and prestigious court positions for male descendants. Yet these advantages came coupled with the burden of maintaining an increasingly mythologized legacy. Yi's eldest son, Yi Ho, who had fought alongside his father at Myeongnyang and witnessed his death, spent subsequent decades clarifying the historical record against emerging exaggerations. "My father was not a god, but a man who studied ceaselessly and worked beyond exhaustion," he read in one clarification petition to the court. His victories came not from heaven's intervention, but from better preparation than his enemies. The naval institutions Yi had transformed continued evolving after his death, though with uneven adherence to his principles. King Seonjo initially maintained the expanded navy Yi had built, preserving both its organizational structure and tactical doctrines. The turtle ships, Yi's signature innovation, remained in active service along Korea's southern coast, with new vessels constructed following his detailed specifications. However, as the Japanese threat receded with decades of peace, complacency gradually returned. By the mid-17th century, Korean naval readiness had declined significantly, with reduced funding, training, and technological development. This regression would prove tragically consequential when Korea faced new maritime challenges in the 19th century, lacking commanders with Yi's foresight and preparation. The most unexpected voyage connected to Yi's legacy occurred in 1604, when a Japanese diplomatic mission arrived in Hanseong, bearing an extraordinary request: permission to establish a shrine honoring the Korean admiral in Japan. This proposal, unprecedented in East Asian diplomatic history, came from Japanese naval officers who had faced Yi in combat and developed professional respect for his capabilities. Though Korean officials rejected the request, finding it inappropriate for their national hero to be venerated by former enemies, the proposition itself revealed Yi's unique status as a military commander, respected even by those he had defeated. Later historical records confirm that unofficial shrines to Yi did eventually appear in several Japanese coastal communities, maintained by local sailors who regarded him as a sea deity whose favor might protect their vessels. Yi's influence extended beyond Korea through unexpected channels. Chinese naval reforms in the early 17th century, responding to increasing piracy along their eastern coast, drew heavily from translated versions of Yi's tactical writings. The Ming naval commander Wu Shiliang explicitly credited methods learned from Admiral Yi in his successful anti-piracy campaigns of 1609-1615. This tactical diffusion reached further when Jesuit missionaries in the Chinese imperial court translated portions of Yi's naval manuals into Latin, eventually reaching European maritime powers. Though rarely acknowledged directly, elements of Yi's convoy protection systems and coordinated ship formations appear in Dutch and English naval doctrines by the late 17th century. Tactical DNA transmitted across continents and cultures. The most profound aspect of Yi's legacy emerged through Korea's evolving national identity during its post-war reconstruction. As the kingdom rebuilt from near destruction, Yi's improbable victories became more than historical events. They transformed into foundational national narratives about Korean resilience and capacity for survival against overwhelming odds. This psychological function proved as important as his tactical innovations, providing cultural continuity through a near-extinction event. When Korea faced subsequent existential threats, particularly the Manchu invasions of the 1630s, Yi's example provided both practical military guidance and psychological fortification against despair. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Yi's legacy came not through official commemorations, but through the transformed lives of ordinary coastal communities he had defended. In fishing villages along Korea's southern coast, traditions emerged that would endure for centuries. Rituals honoring the admiral before vessels departed for sea, nautical practices incorporating principles from his tactical writings, and oral histories preserving accounts of his battles. These communities, which had served as Yi's intelligence network during the war, maintained intimate connection with his memory long after official commemorations had become formalized and distant. Their children learned to sail in waters where Yi's ships had once patrolled, navigating by landmarks that had witnessed his victories. The final voyage of Yi's legacy carried him beyond historical assessment into the realm of national symbol, a transformation accelerated during Korea's darkest hours of subjugation under Japanese colonial rule, 1910 to 1945. With the nation again facing extinction, Yi's achievements offered critical psychological sustenance, proof that Korea had previously overcome even greater threats to its survival. Japanese authorities, recognizing this symbolic power, attempted to restrict commemorations of Yi's victories, inadvertently elevating his importance as a resistance symbol. When Korean independence finally returned, Yi's image appeared on the nation's currency and postage, official recognition of his status as the embodiment of national survival against overwhelming odds. 3 centuries after Yi's death, his tactical foresight received ultimate validation when Japanese naval forces again approached Korean waters during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. The Japanese admiral commanding the operation, Togo Heihachiro, had studied Yi's battles extensively at Japan's Naval Academy. Standing on his flagship's deck as they approached the same waters where Yi had achieved his victories, Togo reportedly told his officers, "We face the ghost of Admiral Yi today. We must prove we have learned the lessons he taught our ancestors at such great cost." The Japanese victory in that modern engagement reflected not just technological superiority, but the integration of Yi's tactical principles by the very nation whose earlier ambitions he had thwarted, perhaps the most ironic tribute to his enduring military relevance. The final measure of Yi's lasting significance appears not in monuments or historical assessments, but in the fundamental reality of Korean national continuity. When Japanese forces invaded in 1592, they encountered a kingdom unprepared, divided, and seemingly destined for absorption into their expanding empire, a fate that befell numerous other Asian states during similar confrontations with stronger powers. That Korea instead survived, maintaining its language, culture, and sovereignty, owes its possibility to the breathing space created by Yi's impossible naval victories. This existential outcome, a nation that continued rather than disappeared, represents Yi Sun-sin's ultimate achievement, a legacy measured not in battles won, but in a civilization's continued existence. As dawn broke on December 16, 1598, Admiral Yi Sun-sin stood on the deck of his flagship, watching Japanese vessels fill the horizon before him. He could not know that his life would end before sunset, nor that his final victory would secure his nation's survival for centuries to come. What he understood, with the clarity that defined his leadership, was simply that the moment demanded his utmost effort regardless of personal consequence. In his war diary's final entry, written hours before the battle began, Yi captured the essence of the leadership philosophy that had guided his 7-year defense of Korea. "I have done all a man can do. The rest belongs to heaven." With these words, Korea's greatest admiral sailed toward his final battle and into immortality. On a crisp autumn morning in 2023, a sleek destroyer slices through the waters of the Myeongnyang Strait, the same narrow channel where, 425 years earlier, Admiral Yi Sun-sin achieved his most improbable victory. The warship bears his name, ROKS Yi Sun-sin, flagship of the modern Korean Navy. As it navigates the passage where 13 vessels once faced hundreds, sailors stand at attention, facing a small island shrine visible on the shoreline. The ship's whistle sounds 3 times, a naval salute to the commander whose tactical genius still guides their doctrine and whose moral example continues to define their service. In Seoul's bustling center stands Yi's most visible monument, a 17-meter bronze statue depicting the admiral in full battle regalia, sword raised toward the sea he defended. Tourists snap photographs while Korean schoolchildren on field trips gather at its base, reciting facts about the naval commander who has transcended history to become something more profound. A cultural touchstone representing the finest qualities Koreans aspire to embody. His image appears on the 101 coin, in countless books, films, television dramas, and video games. A historical figure transformed into popular icon without losing his essential dignity. Yi's tactical innovations found unexpected modern relevance during the Korean War, 1950-1953, when vastly outnumbered South Korean forces faced overwhelming North Korean and Chinese adversaries. Military planners explicitly drew from Yi's asymmetric warfare principles, particularly his methods for maximizing effectiveness when confronting superior numbers. General Paik Sun-yup, South Korea's most decorated officer, directly cited Yi's influence. "When our forces were pushed to the Pusan perimeter, I reminded my officers that Admiral Yi had faced worse odds at Myeongnyang and prevailed through superior positioning and discipline." Beyond military applications, Yi's life story serves broader social purposes in contemporary Korea. In education, his example provides moral instruction, transcending mere patriotism, emphasizing integrity maintained through adversity, dedication to professional excellence, and service prioritized above personal advancement. Business schools study his leadership methods, particularly his systematic approach to seemingly insurmountable challenges and his ability to maximize limited resources through innovation. Even Korean diplomats receive training incorporating Yi's strategic principles, adapted for modern geopolitical environments where Korea continues navigating between larger powers. Perhaps most remarkably, Yi's veneration crosses Korea's otherwise rigid political divides. Progressives celebrate his meritocratic rise despite aristocratic barriers and his concern for common sailors documented in his writings. Conservatives admire his absolute dedication to duty and traditional virtues. This rare consensus reflects Yi's unique position as a figure whose achievements remain unanimously recognized across otherwise polarized perspectives, a shared reference point in Korea's national conversation with itself. The ultimate measure of Yi's enduring significance appears not in monuments or textbooks, but in how ordinary Koreans still invoke his name during moments of national challenge. During the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the spirit of Admiral Yi became shorthand for resilience against overwhelming odds. During the COVID-19 pandemic, public health advertisements quoted his famous declaration before Myeongnyang: "I still have 12 ships under my command." This continuing relevance, a historical figure meaningfully invoked during contemporary crises, reflects Yi's transformation from admiral to archetype, embodying the belief that Korea can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through preparation, discipline, and unwavering resolve. 4 centuries after his death, Yi Sun-sin remains what he has been for generations, not merely Korea's greatest admiral, but the distilled embodiment of its capacity for survival against overwhelming odds. The historical figure who, more than any other, answers the essential question of how Korea endured when so many other nations facing similar challenges disappeared. His final victory at Myeongnyang, purchased with his life, secured not just a military outcome but the continued existence of a civilization. In this achievement, a nation preserved rather than extinguished, Admiral Yi Sun-sin found immortality more profound than any monument could bestow.